Coming up on Prosecuting Darkness with Jeanine Sorrentino and Lisa Andrus.
She ran barefoot through the desert into a barbed wire fence, crawled between the barbed wire, bloody and naked, along the side of the road when a trucker came by, thank God, and picked her up and took her to the police.
Whether you're out in the field for an original crime scene and warrant, whether you're reading a police report, or whether you're watching a child sex exploitation, there is something when you are exposed to this over and over, it's very heavy. It's a heavy, dark world.
Nobody said, this is just what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be tough. You're supposed to work all the time. You can't let anything bother you. You can't show any weakness. That doesn't work. I know detectives who have gone off the rails. They can't handle it. They quit. I know detectives who have committed suicide. Their mental health is shot. They're doing drugs, alcohol. They're divorcing. So many of those things can happen to prosecutors, too.
Welcome to Harmless, the podcast. I'm your host, Eric Oldenburg. And today, I have two very special guests with me. They are both prosecutors who prosecuted crimes against children for several years at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Now, Maricopa County is the county that surrounds the city of Phoenix. And if you remember from my initial episode, I worked with the City of Phoenix Police Department. So this is the agency in which we would submit all of our cases to. So I do a pretty good job of introducing them right within the podcast. So without further ado, I give you Prosecuting Darkness with Jeanine Sorrentino and Lisa Andrus. All right, it's recording. We are going now, so you guys can see it's going. The red light is on. Anyway, first of all, thank you both for being here very much. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on the podcast and talk about your guys' experience working with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. To introduce both of you, I'm here with Jeanine Sorrentino and Lisa Andrus, both prosecutors. One, a previous prosecutor. Lisa is now in the private sector, but Jeanine still works at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. They are both sex crimes, we're both sex crimes prosecutors, and we're here to get their perspective on what it's like to be doing this kind of work, not only from the law enforcement perspective, but obviously from a prosecutor's perspective, which a lot of times goes overlooked. People don't realize that the prosecutors are doing a lot of things that are causing themselves mental health issues, and it's very difficult, challenging work, and that's why I brought these two people on today so we can talk about that. So let's start with Lisa. We'll start with you since you have since left and you are in the private sector. So tell us about, if you would, how you became a prosecutor and then how you went from prosecutions into crimes against children.
I became a prosecutor back in 2003. I would say what really drove my interest was a couple of classes that I was taking in community college. One of the professors, one of the adjuncts, was a former prosecutor, and the way he talked about his cases and had the passion that he had for the cases, for the victims, and that opportunity to be a voice for those that needed to be heard was very attractive to me.
And then how did you move into the crimes against children once you became a prosecutor?
It was actually a pretty easy transition. I had a pretty good feeling that I would end up in something similar, especially I was a part of the system for a long time when I was a child. And I think you find that a lot of people in the industry that work as a prosecutor or law enforcement or in these specialized crimes against children typically have something in their past that will drive them towards that direction. So I was always very passionate about focusing on being a voice for children.
So what year did you start prosecuting crimes against children, roughly?
2005.
That sounds right.
2005? Okay, excellent. And Jeanine?
Yeah, I started in the county attorney's office in 1995, and I think I moved into sex crimes mid-1997. And I've really been there the whole time except for a brief stint in the Homicide Bureau and then in the Family Violence Bureau, where I concentrated really on child deaths and some adult homicides, but mostly child deaths. But I just really love sex crimes, so I went back there as soon as I could.
What was one of the pivotal moments in your career bringing you to the point where you realized this is where I should be? This is the most important work I could be doing.
I had an idea that I wanted to go into child crimes. I think I'm one of the few people, well, maybe not the few people, but I had never really had anything but a good upbringing, a good background as a child. But I was working one summer as an intern in New York at the DA's office, and I was seeing these kids come in and these families come in that were just destroyed. So I had a feeling that I wanted to go into that area. And what happened for me was that Rachel Mitchell, who's the current county attorney and who's running for reelection this upcoming election cycle, she was working in sex crimes. I didn't really know her, but she had a case. The guy's name was Champion, and he was a coach who was molesting boys that he came into contact with through various means. She needed help on that case because there were so many kids involved and so many interviews and so much work to do. And so she asked me if I would be interested in helping. And that's really what sealed, I guess you could say, sealed my fate, because I knew working on that case, that's what I wanted to do.
Why was it so important to you, do you think? Why did it feel so right?
It just made me angry. The thought of, and how dare you as an adult touch a child? How dare you? And I just was so angry, and I just wanted to make it stop. And I was seeing what these boys were going through. 'Cause I think a lot of people think of girls as being the victims, not so much thinking of the boys. But when the boys are victimized, it brings up a whole host of other issues for them. And they were just destroyed because they loved this person who was doing this to them, and they wanted to be with him and spend time with him. They didn't like what was happening. And when that relationship finally broke, when we caught him, these kids were really conflicted and they needed a lot of help, and it was heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's terrible. Did you have anything? What was pivotal for you?
It's so funny because I have a similar story, but a different case, still Rachel Mitchell, because I was coming to the unit and I was up there on the floor one day and she said, I'm getting ready to start this trial and nobody's available. It's class 6. I want to say it was class 6.
It was a priest case, right?
Yes, it
Yeah.
was. It was Father Brasinio. And it sounded like something that was going to be very low key. And you're walking into this trial that there was all of these investigations and grand juries done as far as the different ways of putting together the cases. And so when there was this opportunity for this case, and I just happened to walk in and it sounded so simple, I'm like, sounds like I'm being voluntold with a great opportunity and a little bit scary, especially for your first case out of the box. But the opportunity to sit with Rachel or Jeanine or these seasoned prosecutors that are amazing at their job, I was never going to pass that up. But being a part of that trial and watching Rachel with the victim. So this case was an old case. So this was a case that occurred in the 80s. So when the victim came in, he was in his 40s. And he was really still in a bad place. So he came in for witness prep, and he was just sobbing and sobbing. And Rachel was so good with him. It was after hours. She got up, she shut the door. It was just the two of us sitting there with this male victim, and you could still see him struggling with those demons from yesterday, and very salient. But the way that she was able to with him and get him ready to testify, really unbelievable.
So that was it for you at that point.
Was.
Do you remember the outcome of that case?
He ended up pleading guilty.
Excellent. So, do you guys remember your first case that you were the lead on?
Yeah, I remember my case, my very first case. Interestingly, the man's name was Mr. Hyman, which is funny to those of us in sex crimes because, obviously, he had molested his daughter, and it just, according to her, she was very young, it just started out of nowhere. There didn't seem to be any grooming, at least not what she was describing at the time we did the interview. Her name was Madison, and this goes back to literally 20, 25, 26 years. The first time he ever did anything to her, he actually had intercourse with her, and the way he persuaded or encouraged or convinced her to let him or to engage with him was that her cat had just had kittens. And so he took a bucket of water and he put the kittens in the bucket and started filling the bucket with water. And he told her if she didn't come in the house and do what he said, he was going to drown her kittens. So to save her kittens, she went in knowing that he was going to be having sex with her because he told her, that's what I want to do. She was young. I don't think she really understood what that meant, but she knew that it was something. She knew that it was something that kids shouldn't be doing and that it was something that you don't do with your dad. But she agreed to go in the house and do it because she wanted to save her kittens. And from that point on, it was just full, all the time, out and out sexual intercourse and everything else you can think of. That was the first case that I tried by myself. It was actually the first case I tried as a sex crimes prosecutor, because back then, when I started, we didn't really have what we have now, which is a training program in sex crimes that, again, was something that Rachel developed when she was a bureau chief. Now we have the new prosecutors. They'll sit through 1 or 2 cases with a seasoned prosecutor and just observe. And then after they've learned a little bit from that, then they will start trying their own cases again with one of us. So now my job is to teach them and to assist them. So I'll go and I'll sit with them and make sure that they're doing everything okay. If they get in the weeds, if they need help, there's somebody there. We didn't do that back then. You just got some advice from the seasoned prosecutors and went in on your own. And it was terrifying because I had done trials before in trial group. I had done burglaries, aggravated assaults, that kind of thing. So I had some experience under my belt. But with these cases, you know that if you make a mistake and you don't win, that kid's going back into that home and they're going to continue to be abused or molested. The stakes are high and it's terrifying. Quite honestly, not everybody can do it.
That's a pressure that I didn't even consider.
Yeah.
Is the pressure of if I fail at this, which is probably how you frame it in your mind. If I fail, even though it's not really personally a failure, that this person is going to go back and continue, and and the victim's going to be put in an unsafe environment. It's so nice to hear, though, that they have actually developed a training program to not leave somebody in the situation that you were in when you first started with this.
Yeah, we do our best. I'm in charge of the training program now. That's my job as the senior attorney over there, is to work with the bureau chiefs to mentor and do the training. And we do our best. Sometimes sex crimes is always in trials. There's only really 3 of us. So sometimes we have to pair up a moderately experienced attorney with one of the new ones. But we always try to make sure that nobody's going in blind and by themselves, because that doesn't help anybody. It's not good for their mental health. It's not good for the case. It's not good for the child. And I think that now that we have that program, we've definitely seen the turnaround in sex crimes decrease. We used to have, Lisa, you probably remember when you were over there, it was every couple of weeks we were having somebody leave.
Right.
We don't really have that now. If somebody does leave, it's usually to go to another place within the office.
And do you assign that to the training, to the fact that now we're not just throwing people into it?
I assign it in some ways to the training. I assign it to the fact that the county attorney we have now has really done a great deal to make sure that people are getting appropriate raises. We have a program in place now that's like an attorney tier form. So like when you're tier 1, here's your salary range. And when you meet these goals, you can then apply to move up to tier 2 and the salary range goes up. So there's a clear and definite path. And I think that started 6-7 years ago, but that has been maintained and improved over the course of time. So I think the attorneys now are more confident knowing that we don't make very much in the beginning. And a lot of these kids who come in, they're young and they're at the age, they're out of law school, they're married, they're starting to have children. And you add in the pressure and the number of hours you put in. and you compare that to the compensation. And there was a huge incentive for people to leave after getting some experience and go into the private sector to represent sex offenders. We've had several people from our unit over the course in the year that when you were there. I want to say there were two in particular that left to go start their own law firms, and this is what they specialize in now. I'm not going to name names because obviously I'm not going to, but yeah, there were several who left after we did all this training. Rachel, or Miss Mitchell, I should say, she started to look at what was happening, and she said, what can we do to stop this tide of people leaving? And we can't control the salary, but what we can control is the amount of stress. And the theory was, if we give them more support and make them understand that they're just not hanging out there on their own, then that will alleviate some of the stress. Because I think that a lot of people who want to do this work, they're very committed, and they are willing to put up with a lower salary that they'd make in the private sector. But something has to give. It can't be a perfect storm. What do you think, Lisa, about that?
I agree with you 100%. I think the focus on mental health, and as a prosecutor, as law enforcement, the amount of toxic that we're exposed to every day is unbelievable. Whether you're out in the field going with SWAT to a house for an original crime scene and warrant, whether you're reading a police report, or whether you're watching the child pornography. There is something, when you are exposed to this over and over, it's very heavy. It's a heavy, dark world. And even more so, I think, when you see hands-on offenders here in Maricopa County manufacturing child pornography. And I think that programs that have been in place and they have been focused on since then is to try to provide that support back to the prosecutors, as well as a mindset of innovation. So it may not necessarily be traditional mental health. You need to go talk to somebody, as much as it is, what can we do to get you away from your desk to help clear your head? What can we do so that you're just completely overwhelmed by this toxic caseload day in and day out, day in and day out?
And I add, we're both sex crimes prosecutors, and then I have a family violence and homicide. So I'm gearing my remarks to that. But I want you to understand, Eric, that just because you're not in sex crimes doesn't mean you don't go through this as a prosecutor. So let me give you a couple of examples. The people who do, for example, vehicular crimes, that's really hard because those guys are going out to crime scenes, and they're there when they're basically scraping somebody off the pavement. They're watching that happen. They are prosecuting somebody who may be a very law-abiding citizen who's got children who are about to start college, or their wife just had a baby and they've had a DUI accident and they've killed somebody. And it's hard because you feel for their family, but you've just seen this horrible thing, this accident, and this person is just decimated from this. And I think that's really hard. That's not something I've ever done. I've never worked in that unit. And I don't think that's probably the one place in the office that I would not want to work. Everybody has their thing, right?
Yeah.
That's like my thing. And then when you look at people who, for example, work in the gang units, so these people are seeing a lot of assaults, homicides, gang-related crimes, and it's very stressful for them because those defendants, those are the people that are going to come after you. And I recall back in the 90s, a friend of mine was prosecuting the Mexican mafia. They had hatched a plan to kill the director of DOC. I can't remember, is it Henderson?
Yes.
I think at the time. And of course, the detectives are listening on jail calls and that. And the MA, or the Mexican mafia, they wanted to kill this prosecutor.
Yeah.
So they had to put an alarm safety system in her house, and every place she went, she had 2 gang detectives with her. So that unit is very stressful because it's stressful in a different way. You have to worry about your own safety and that of your family. The stress is not just limited to us and what we do. It's all through the entire office or field, I guess I should say. It's just different in each field.
If you could quantify what exactly in your field is the most stressful thing, because you said scraping people off the pavement and clearly showing empathy towards the people that are committing the crimes. And empathy is a big thing that a lot of people have trouble getting a hold of, especially in these cases, to have any type of empathy for the offenders. But first off, what would you say the most stressful part of these crimes is? Is it watching the incident occur on video? Is it speaking to the victims? Is it like, what would you quantify as the unique stress of prosecuting crimes against children?
I think that's probably different for everyone. Lisa, what do you think?
I think it vacillates. Sometimes your victim doesn't want to cooperate. Sometimes the victim's guardian doesn't want the victim to cooperate. Sometimes the judge doesn't feel that the plea offer is appropriate. Sometimes it's the defendant. Sometimes it's the families. Sometimes it's the nature of the case or the evidence itself. And I really think that Jeanine's point earlier of the pressure of if I fail, if this doesn't end up in some type of a guilty plea, then this person is going to go back out and not only reoffend, but will be more prolific about it.
I think the part of my job that I hate the most, and then there's a lot of parts that, like, when you prosecute sex crimes, you don't usually have a good day. It's bad all the time.
Yeah.
The number one worst thing for me is when I get a new case or a new submittal from the police, whether it's an arrest or a basket case, whatever it is, and I evaluate that case and I have to tell that victim, I know you're telling the truth and I know he did these things to you. I believe you, but I can't prosecute your case. And the reason that happens is because we call them he said, she said. So a child or a woman will come in and say, this is what happened to me. And maybe we don't have any physical evidence to back it up. Maybe the police have interviewed the suspect and he's denied or he's given an alibi or whatever story he's told to get himself out of trouble. So we don't have any statements from the suspect. We don't have any physical evidence. There are no witnesses. There are almost never witnesses because people don't molest. They do molest kids in public, but they do it in such a way that you can't really see that happening. That is the number one thing when somebody has the courage to finally come forward and report somebody, very often somebody in their own family or circle of friends that they love. And they finally get the courage to tell what happened. And I have to sit down and explain to a parent or a victim or even a child, we can't proceed because my standard of proof, my ethical standard is I can't prosecute or I can't bring a case unless there's a reasonable likelihood of conviction. So I'm evaluating these cases on the strength of the evidence. And sometimes the evidence is just that we have multiple victims, and we file a lot of those cases. But sometimes no matter what you do, no matter how much investigation, you ask the police to go out, and our detectives are great. They'll do what we ask them to do. They will go out and see if they can unearth any evidence or talk to any other family members to see if there's any other victims out there. They'll take all these steps. But sometimes at the end of the day, there's just not enough and we can't go forward. That is the worst part of my job for me, is having to tell a victim, I'm sorry, but I can't do this.
What percentage would you say of those cases come through that you can't prosecute?
You know, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I've really kept track. I think in sex crimes, we probably file more cases than we turn down, definitely. But I couldn't give you a percentage off the top of my head.
What percentage of the people have been found not guilty in the cases that you've tried?
In the cases that I've tried,
Yeah.
I can tell you I do not remember every single case that I've won. I remember every single case that I've lost. In my career, I've lost 7 cases.
Lisa?
And I remember every single thing about all of those cases.
Oh, wow.
Those are the ones you remember.
Yeah, I would like to ask what you would, is there anything you would have changed about, maybe in a broad stroke, that you would change that may have change the outcome of any of those cases, if not all of them?
I think one or two. When I was new, I just didn't really have the experience to know how to meet the defense attorney arguments. Sometimes when you're new especially, you're up against very good defense attorneys. And I think any prosecutor who loses a case blames themselves. But my experience has been more often than not, it's not the prosecutor, it's the facts, it's the jury. I'll give you an example. I tried a man he was older. He had a grandson who was an adult, and then the grandson had a son who was around 7 or 8. And this man for years had been trading pornography with his friends. And this was back before it was as prolific as it is today on the computer. So a lot of this was via mail. This case actually came to us from the U.S. Postal Inspectors and then transferred over to a police agency because we realized there were hands-on offenses with the grandson and the grandson's son, so the great-grandson. We had videotapes of the man molesting the grandson and then later on his great-grandson. And one of those videotapes, because now I'm dating it, because they were actually videotapes.
Yeah.
They were in a motel or a hotel, and he was filming, telling the little boy what to do. And the little boy was following instructions and touching himself and those things. And the guy was had a camera and he was videotaping it. What he wasn't thinking about is it was a hotel and there was a glass mirror on the sliding door to the closet. And when he was videotaping the kid, we could see him in the mirror videotaping the kid.
Wow.
So we played that for the jury. They could see him making the pornography, and they acquitted him because they felt really bad for him because he was super old. And after the trial, their only question for me was, now, where's he going to live? Are you going to make sure he has a place to go when this is over? That was what they were worried about. And then to add insult to injury, he wanted his property back. The case agent called me and said, what do I do? And I said, go ahead and give him the property back. And the minute you give it back to him, arrest him for possessing child pornography.
There you go.
Obviously, his defense attorney talked him out of going to that meet to get his property back.
Well, that doesn't sound like, Jeanine, that doesn't sound like any type of failure that on
So-
your part whatsoever. That sounds like a jury that's just,
Yeah, that's an example. I really think that most of the time when prosecutors lose cases, they do everything they can. And sometimes all it takes is one juror.
yeah.
And especially now where we have virtually no control over jury selection, we don't have strikes anymore.
I do want to say, I know you said you focus on the ones that you lost, but you've won countless ones and you've saved a lot of children from a lot of horrible situations. So try to focus on that instead of on the negative, which we all like to do, that the one that got away, if you will. Lisa, any cases in your mind that stand out as that you would have done something differently, or because it sounds like there really wasn't anything you could have done in that one. You've had him quite literally dead to rights.
Yeah, in that case particularly, I've tried several cases like that where we had a full confession or we've got a confrontation call or a one-party consent call where the suspect is on the phone talking to the victim and we're recording it and he's admitting, I shouldn't have done those things to you. I'm really sorry. It'll never happen again. And then the jury acquits him because they like him. One guy was a cop.
Terrifying to me. That's scary.
Yeah.
Did you say one was a cop?
This guy was a cop. He molested his best friend's daughter. The father, who was also a police officer, found out about it. The girl was emailing with him, so there were some sexual emails. And then there was a one-party consent call where the father called his friend and confronted him. This is what my daughter said. He made admissions. And then when he talked to the investigating officer, he confessed. The jury walked him.
I had that happen.
Mm-hmm.
I had the exact same thing.
I remember that case.
It was like the Holy Trinity because you had you had DNA on the genitals.
Yep.
On the child's genitals. And the child was under 5. And a confession. And it was a 1-count directed verdict. Didn't even get to the defense side. And I think when you're the prosecutor and you've gone through all of that and that happens on a directed verdict, which is where the judge is saying there's not enough evidence to move the case forward. So therefore we're dismissing it. That's essentially what a directed verdict is. And it was just a very hard thing to absorb.
How do
'Cause
you how do you
that
deal with that? How do you deal with the horror of hearing that?
I don't even know. I don't need,
Yeah, it's insane.
you have to, if you're going to do this job, you have to have two things. You have to have the ability to take yourself out and dissociate from what you're doing and what you're seeing every day. And that includes when you lose. Okay.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you have to, and we can talk more about that because the prosecutors that I've seen stay in this career in this area for a period of time, they have the ability to remove themselves from that inner turmoil and block it. You block it up. The second thing you have to have is a good support system, because when you lose a case that you know you should have won, like I still don't understand how that judge directed verdict. We had DNA, we had a mother walk in and see, it defies common sense. But these offenders are really good at manipulating people. They have to be, because otherwise nobody would let them near children. So they're, I would say, among the most highly manipulative are sex offenders and then domestic violence abusers. So you really, if you don't have that support system and that ability to remove yourself and pack it away, I will tell you, when I lost that case with the grandson, that was bad, but I also knew that his dad was going to protect him and not let him have any more contact with this guy.
Okay,
That case, I knew the kid was safe. That's the worst part for me, is not that I lost, and you feel bad because you lose, because of course you're a lawyer and you're highly competitive, but knowing what that kid is going to go back into. Now, a lot of times that doesn't happen because DCS has stepped in and removed the child from the home. So in those cases, you're lucky, but I think people deal with it. I've seen everything from, I've been lucky because I think we've been lucky. I have never, in the years that I've been in sex crimes, I have never seen one of our attorneys that I thought was using drugs. I have seen one or two that I think were drinking. And if we see that, we obviously step in to get help for somebody. But that has really, it has not been my experience. That is a huge coping mechanism in my line of work. Some people cope by exercising. Some people cope by over-exercising, under-eating, overeating, all the coping mechanisms that normal people, we're not normal, but normal people use. What do you think are some of the things that people do, Lisa?
Well, I myself have found myself at the bottom of a chip bag
Yeah.
at the end of trial.
Feeling.
And then you said, "Oh, how did that happen?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other coping mechanisms, the healthy ones, I think, are the try to have some humor, not towards a victim or a defendant or a family or anything like that, but try to have a little bit of jovial to a lot of the negativity. And I think that unit was very good about finding a little bit of humor within all of this darkness. Certainly exercise is one. I know people that have and do still see a psychiatrist or a psychologist once a week, and they're committed to that. I think there's a lot of people that will do something, whatever that something is, cooking, sewing, crocheting, gaming. And so they're removing themselves from that circumstance, and then they're being present in some type of a hobby that they really enjoy.
Because it's such an emotionally charged thing. So trying to get that emotion or disconnect yourself from the emotion is extremely important. I wanted to ask you guys, what's the percentage of the cases that you have that actually go to plea?
Percentage-wise, I probably couldn't give you an exact number. It used to be a lot more, because up until, when did Simpson come out? Was that?
14?
Yeah. Or when did it change? 2014, 2015.
Simpson
There used to
2.
be a law in Arizona that if you were charged with what's called a dangerous crime against children, which is sex or child molesting with a child who's under the age of 15, you are not eligible for bond. I want to say that started in 2001 or 2002. And then that was the law until about 2014 or so. At that point, the law changed and people were eligible for bond unless you could prove to the court that they were a danger, and there was no other way of monitoring in the community that could make it safe for the community and the child, which, depending on your judge, could be a really high burden. Everybody has a different opinion on what's appropriate, and a lot of the judges really did not like that these people were non-bondable. So when that law changed, what happened was a lot of these people who were not eligible for bond, like Lisa's caseload that she handled was basically child pornography, or what we now call child sexual exploitation. Those people are very often let out on low bonds by the court, or even on pretrial services release, because the judge looks at the case and says all they're doing is looking at stuff on the internet. They're not making it. They're not molesting any children that we know of. And we see those people out. We see a lot of our sex offenders now do get out. They're able to meet the bond, and then they're just out there in the community. There's no incentive for them to take a plea. Even if we have very good evidence on them, who's going to plead until they're forced by the system into making a decision? Now, I think we still do take a lot of pleas, but it takes longer to get there. Certainly a lot fewer pleas than we used to do in the past, but I know people are critical of the plea system, but you need to understand that. I'm trying to think now. I'm going to say we have about 16 attorneys, give or take, at any given time in sex crimes. If we stopped doing pleas and we had to try every case, you would need to give 100 more attorneys to us.
Yeah.
And you would need 100 more judges. The system, it can't function without plea offers.
Yeah.
Now, there is a time and a place for a plea offer and a time and a place to not make a plea offer, and that's going to differ based on your cases. But I would definitely say that our Maricopa County Arizona in general, has some of the, if not the harshest sex crimes laws in the country.
I've traveled the world, and we have the state of Arizona has the strictest like Sharia law style, but we have the strictest penalties when it comes to child sex exploitation and cases like that, especially with the dangerous crimes against children add on to that. So for sure. So when you hear about the plea agreement, don't think this is being knocked down to a misdemeanor and we're going to do this or that. This is a completely different animal when it comes to a plea. And like Jeanine just said, it's taking this work that would take months and months and months and months, and you're getting rid of it quickly. It's not to say that the offender's getting off by any stretch of the imagination, but it is something that is largely misunderstood in the world. People think it's going to be changed to.
Well, and to add another point, one of the things that's always critical, I think, in a prosecutor's mind is having the victim testify. One of the things, the youngest victim that I had on the stand was 5.
Oh.
And the only thing that she could say was, I was sitting crisscross applesauce and he licked me.
Ugh.
And you knew what she meant. She
Yeah.
didn't know who it was. And again, this was another circumstance where mom walks in. So what happened is relatively straightforward. But that also goes into that factoring on whether or not to offer a plea, because some victims, whether they may be young, some may not be cooperating, some may actually feel that they're still in love with their offender. And they don't necessarily feel that any prison time is appropriate. I had a case years ago, and the defendant was portraying a 17-year-old. And they met online, and the victim obviously was here, and he traveled here twice. But he had groomed her so much so that when he came back the second time and she saw him as a 55-year-old man, she believed that she was in love with him, and regardless of what he wanted to do to her, running away from her parents, all of these different pieces, he was the only person that understood her and cared for her. So she, in her head, was still going to go with him several months later or another 6 months after that. And her parents, because I remember very saliently sitting down with them, and their question was, my kid is so smart and she's so talented. How does something like this happen? And I was trying to explain it, and it's not about whether your child is smart or anything that has to do with that. It's about, this is a young person, and this person is feeling heard. They're feeling that there's a connection. And so when you get to the act itself, that child feels a certain amount of protectiveness over the offender.
Wow. Yeah, wow. That's incredible. But it's something that absolutely needs to be understood, is not wanting to basically re-traumatize the victim again. That's another, especially having to walk into a courtroom full of strangers and discuss the worst moment of your life, or the worst moments, or whatever, the incident, however long it took place. Just having described that, I couldn't even possibly imagine. That has to be incredibly stressful as just being the prosecutor, knowing you're putting them through it.
Well, and people don't want to talk about what they do in the evening with their spouses as grown adults.
Yeah.
That's,
Think about it. If
it's,
they did this at a training, I wasn't there. Rachel Mitchell was at the training, and this was years ago. The person who was presenting the lecture, there was a break, and the person said, okay, on the break, we're going to have a half-hour break. Go out and partner up with anybody else who's in the class, and take turns. You each have to tell the other one about your last sexual experience with your partner. And then when we come back in, the person that you talk to is going to describe it to the room. Now, this did not really happen.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of people left. A lot of the police officers who were in that training left and did not come back, because who wants to sit and talk about even a consensual relationship with someone they love to another adult,
Right.
let alone the kids? And with some of these kids, we always say the kids love the abuser and they hate the abuse, but it's not always true that they hate the abuse. And people need to understand, and I am not putting any amount of responsibility on a child. There's a reason we have these laws. Kids are very vulnerable to manipulation. And when you start seeing, especially teenage boys and teenage girls, hormones are raging. People want a boyfriend, they want a girlfriend. You're feeling alienated. Your parents suck. They're stupid. They don't understand you. And this person comes in who's sometimes 20, 30 years older than you, and they understand. They know what you're going through. Yeah, your parents are horrible. You should come and spend the night at my house. We'll go out and we'll do X, Y, Z, and we'll have so much fun, and we can invite your friends. These kids start to feel very, that's the one person who makes them feel confident and special. And then you're also, with teenagers, you're talking about, like I said, hormones are flowing. Offenders aren't stupid. Most offenders don't physically injure the children. We think of child abuse and child molest as they're holding the child down and they're sexually assaulting them brutally, and that's not what it is. The offenders are smart enough to not hurt the children and to do things that even a child, even though they don't understand what's happening, might think, this feels good, this is okay. They do that for a reason. They do it because they don't want the child to get scared and to go off and tell somebody. So there's a lot that goes into this, and what happens is you get a lot of kids who, when they do tell, they feel guilty. And part of the reason they don't tell is because they're afraid. Their parents are going to say, you didn't tell. This was going on for years, so you must have liked this. You must have wanted this to happen. So there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in a child, how they respond to a molester. The closer a person is to the child, the closer of a relationship they have. Those are the people who have to do the least work manipulating the kids. So if it's somebody who is a stranger, that person's going to either have to snatch the kid off the street, or they're going to have to spend some time building a relationship. But if it's the favorite uncle, everybody wants to be with that guy. Everybody loves that guy. So then the kids feel guilty because they think they let it happen, and they are now guilty because that parent's getting in trouble, or that family member. And then what with a lot of the kids is they will develop negative coping skills. So you see a lot of the kids drinking, being promiscuous, doing drugs, cutting themselves. We have cases where we've had to plead it down to an almost intolerably low offer because the child is suicidal and is a mental health institute. I can't put that child on the stand and destabilize that child further. I'm not going to break a child mentally or emotionally. We don't do that. Now, we'll persuade a child to come in, but if somebody's truly mentally unstable, or if they're, for example, we've had kids who are addicted to drugs, and so now they're in rehab. Do we want to destabilize that child who's doing well in rehab by making them come in and sit there, not only tell the jury, but the offender's sitting right there? They have to talk about this in front of the person that molested them.
That's something that a lot of people don't contemplate. I certainly didn't think about that. And it's interesting. I interviewed a detective recently who said during trainings, that's what he does, is he walks up to someone and he says, describe in detail, just a random person, describe in detail the last time you masturbated. Just tell everybody in the class right now, to demonstrate exactly what Rachel did in that training, the same thing. People don't realize just the subject matter itself is so hard to discuss, and then add all the layers on top of it where it's a horrible thing that happened. You may still have feeling, like all these things just swirling through the mind. That adds a totally unique perspective, a unique set of stressors on somebody having to prosecute these cases. So kudos to you guys for being able to handle that. Now, I wanted to talk about a case. I interviewed Detective Phyllis Walker, who told me about a case, and I did a separate interview of her with a case study. And she had mentioned Lisa Andrus as being the prosecutor and said some kind of interesting things about that. So can you tell us about this case? You know who I'm talking about?
I do.
I assume.
Yeah,
Can you tell us about this case?
And we both really like Phyllis. We've known her for years. She was always a very excellent detective.
Yeah, she's a super hard worker, and she's one of those people that leaned into the work so much that she ground herself down, unfortunately. But yeah. So anyway.
Detective Walker is fabulous. But to your question, it was an individual that he went to prison in the 90s for about 10 years for the same type of offense. He got out of prison and went to go live with a friend of his. And there was 3 young children, girls, in the home. And the way that he groomed them was being in the pool with them, let me throw you, and would start touching them that way. He would invite them into his room to see his reptiles. Would you like to hold the reptiles? And then he would touch them inappropriately that way. There was a lot of bartering back and forth between his animals and hanging out with the kids to start manufacturing sex exploitation. And in that case, he was arrested, and we knew about the 3 victims. 2 disclosed, 1 did not, but we still had 2 victims and some corroboration. And through the forensic exam, we discovered a 4th victim. And I know this conversation for which you're talking about, because Phyllis and I, who, like I said at the beginning, have nothing but incredible respect for, incredibly hard worker, I looked at her and I said, you need to go find this child. And she looked at me like I had 8 heads.
Yeah.
And she was like, it's not like she has a driver's license. And I said, but you're the detective. Detect. And I think at that point in time, she probably wanted to choke me, which may have been appropriate or not. But my point to her was, you can go back and talk to the children's parents that were in the home. Who else does this suspect, who was now a defendant, spend time with? Who is he friends with? There's phone records that you could subpoena. There are ways to at least make the effort. I'm not saying that you have to or you will, but we know this child exists in Maricopa County just because of the dates. And based on the photos that we were seeing, it was oral sex on him that he was taking photos of. And she was 6, maybe 7. So it was very important to me that at least we tried. We may not have been successful, but at least we've made best efforts. And I think, and at the end of that conversation, I know Detective Walker agreed, but I think that we were just on opposite ends just because of the question almost seemed to bring about an expectation like there's just go find any child in Maricopa County. This should be very simple. And I never meant it in that way as much as we have to do something to take steps to find this child, identify this child, because that's so critical.
Absolutely. What was the outcome of that case?
He was found guilty at trial. I think he got over 100 plus years.
Were you guys able to find her, the last victim?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
Very good.
Again, kudos to Detective Walker because she was excellent at detecting.
And she had nothing but nice things to say about you as well, being the prosecutor. She loved working with you. It's very, very cool. Before we started talking, before we started recording, Jeanine, you were talking about a case where a girl had run through a barbed wire fence. And I believe in Phyllis's interview, she also talks about that case. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I actually heard the episode where Phyllis was talking about that case. This is quite a while ago. Lisa was pretty new in the unit back then, so I was taking her with me on a lot of my cases. But this particular man was either married or the boyfriend of the girl's mom. The girl was a teenager. She was highly uncomfortable around this man. But somebody making you uncomfortable, we can't remove a child from the house because somebody's making you uncomfortable. I think she knew the direction this was going in. And unfortunately, he was able to manipulate her one day to tell her she was just old enough to learn how to drive. She was 16. So he said, I will teach you how to drive, but you got to come with me. We got to go now. So she gets in the truck reluctantly. And he takes her out into the desert, and she doesn't know where she is. And he has, we call it a rape kit. He had rings attached to the floor of his van, because it's always a van. Rings attached to the floor of the van. He had zip ties. I think he actually even had a couple of chains with cuffs around him that he put around her legs. He was larger than her. She was terrified. What do you do? You're 16 years old. And this guy was really dangerous. He had a bag full of women's underwear that was dirty. We don't know where he got it from, but he had been planning to sexually assault her or somebody else for a while. She was able to convince him to uncuff her. I can't remember how she did that. I don't know. Do you remember, Lisa? Did she say she had to go to the bathroom or?
It was either go to the bathroom or I can do more with you intimately
If you uncuff
me.
So he uncuffed her, and she took her chance when she could to get out of the van, and she ran barefoot through the desert into a barbed wire fence, crawled between the barbed wire, and was bloody and naked along the side of the road when a trucker came by. And he saw her, and he stopped, thank God, and picked her up and took her to the police. And that's how we got him. And he was There are two people in my career that have terrified me, that I've been physically afraid of myself. He's one of them. He was chilling. He represented himself in court, in trial. He thought he was smarter than everyone. He was very soft-spoken. He was actually very intelligent, very soft-spoken. And then all of a sudden, when he didn't get his way, if the court didn't rule in his favor, if he didn't like something I said, all of a sudden he would turn on a dime. And it was a completely different person. It was chilling to watch.
What was the result of that case?
It was interesting because Lisa was with me. Why don't you tell it?
Yeah.
You were there. You saw it.
This could be, it's one of my favorite Jeanine stories. We were there getting ready for trial. She's showing him the PowerPoint because on each side has to walk through what evidence they're going to present, etc. And because he was pro per representing himself, Jeanine wanted to be extra sure that he had all this information to try to lessen any claims on appeal. So she's showing him the PowerPoint, and she's looking through the PowerPoint herself. And he starts to get crossways with his attorney because he wants his advisory council to be doing something. And court comes in and it starts, and so everybody stops and goes to their respective table. Jeanine has her computer and continues to flip through the PowerPoint, and you can just see him getting more and more agitated. And he's just sitting there, probably from me to you, just getting more and more agitated looking at her PowerPoint, because now he can't look, he can see it, but he can't touch the screen or manipulate the keys.
Right.
Court takes a break again, and we call it an off the chain matter because of the type of offense that he's charged with. So everybody's out. It's really the deputy, Jeanine, myself, and advisory council. And he starts asking about a plea. And he says, I'm not doing anything less than a dime or something like that.
He didn't want to do anything more than.
Yeah. I won't take anything less than a dime. 10. And he said something, and he got up and stood up, and he starts walking towards Jeanine, and she stands up. And she just looks at him and she's, you want to know something? She's got her finger almost in his face because he's coming at her. And the deputy's up, he's walking towards her. And she's got her finger up and she said, you're just angry because finally a woman has had the guts to stand up to you and you can't push somebody down anymore. That's your problem right now.
I was terrified because some of our deputies are, I'll be kind. Some of them are not the most physically fit individuals. So the court deputies that bring the people over from the jail, they may be a little old. They're typically retired police officers. And some of them are rotund. So you don't actually know how quick they're going to be on their feet. But you got to stand up to those people. He ended up taking a plea. I want to say he got 35 years.
Yeah, I think that's right.
He ended up pleading because we started jury selection and the jurors were just as freaked out by this guy. It was just something about his aura. I don't mean to sound like, woo, but like when you were in the presence of this guy, you could feel the evil coming off of him. You could feel it. I remain convinced to this day that he has other victims who may not have survived. He used to take trips out to California, and we found all these maps of really remote places in the desert, which he's not a hunter, he's not a sportsman. Why are you going out there? Hopefully that's just my own paranoia, but you could just feel the evil coming from this guy, and the jurors were freaked out about it. And they would tell the court, I'm sorry, like, I can't sit on this jury. He just looks like he's guilty. He looks like a sex offender. It is rare for a juror to say that. But this guy was just that evil is the only word that begins to describe the feeling that get around this man, which is, I think, why the victim was so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Even though he wasn't doing anything to her. Go ahead.
And as a young prosecutor, watching this play out in real time in front of me, watching my mentor be so brave, it was probably one of the neatest moments that I have seen. I would even...
If that was brave or stupid.
Well, you're still here. You're still here, so
still
it was
here.
brave.
Yeah. I would put that in front of... Do you remember the settlement conference that we were sitting at? And the offender said, I don't think you understand, Judge. You don't understand how sexually demanding she is. And he took the court took a recess. And we were sitting at the table. And you were so heated. And you said, Mr. Defendant, is that your name? And your finger's up and you're very close.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Okay.
Is that your name? Because let me tell you something. She's... And there is no way you are ever going to convince anybody that she is sexually demanding. And you said, I am offended on behalf of the victim. I'm offended on behalf of the victim's family. And she was like, you're going to take this plea or you're going down.
I think it was Judge Cates, right? That's
Wow.
actually Judge Cates took a break because this guy was a settlement conference, so they're very informal. You've probably sat through them, but the judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the defendant, the victim, if they want to be there, everybody's there, and the idea is to talk about the case, make sure the defendant understands what he's facing if he goes to trial and loses, and then to make sure he understands what the plea is. He has an opportunity to ask questions of the prosecutor and the judge. This is typically going to not be the trial judge. It's going to be another judge because they need to maintain their neutrality. And we'll answer any questions that they have. Their attorney's there to make sure that they're not opening their mouth and confessing to things that they shouldn't. But this guy just wouldn't keep his mouth shut. And I remember him telling Judge Cates some very specific details about this little girl and how she was coming on to him and what she was doing with her body parts to get his attention, and how this really wasn't his fault. He couldn't possibly be blamed for this because he was just the innocent party, and what's a man to do? And the judge actually, he's okay, we're taking a break. And he had actually got up and left the room because I think he was so on the edge of, you just wanted to punch this guy.
Yeah.
And obviously you can't, as the judge, show any anger, but it was just so offensive to everybody that.
What boggles my mind is that person didn't think that people would find it so offensive and egregious. Did he actually believe that what he was saying?
He did. A lot of them convinced themselves that the kids are okay with this and they like it and they want it. I had a man actually one time confess on the stand in trial under similar circumstances. The victim was his daughter, and she was an older teenager, 15, 16 years old. And he took the stand, and I said something to him like, "It seems to me that you were sexually attracted to your daughter." And he was like, "I was, but that's not my fault because she would come and sit on my lap and she would do this and she would," and it was literally like, I can't, like, even today thinking back, I don't have words I'm hearing him say this on cross-examination in a courtroom with the jury there, and like all other sound disappeared. All I could hear was wah, wah. Because nobody ever confesses on the witness stand in court, except this guy did, because he thought he was going to be able to explain to the jury why this wasn't his fault. And a lot of the offenders are able to convince themselves because they don't see themselves as bad people. Very often, they're people who have good careers and loving families, and sometimes they're pillars of their community and they're active in church. They don't see themselves as bad people. These guys would be the first to tell you if somebody else is molesting a kid, that person is disgusting and they should go to prison for what they've done to that kid. But they don't see themselves in the same light. It's chilling.
That's terrible. I wanted to ask both of you if you could go back in time and give your brand new prosecutor self a bit of advice. What would it be to help get you through what you've put yourself through?
I would probably say to do the very best that you can. But at the end of the day, you need to forgive yourself for anything that you're beating yourself up about. Otherwise, you carry that around with you constantly. We've talked a little bit about it earlier, and we still do as prosecutors. When you're in trial, you look back and you're like, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that." And it's fine to learn. We should all be self-reflective and we should all learn, but not to the point where, and because of the severity of the cases, I would say you went out there, you did your very best, you left it all in the courtroom, and the chips are going to fall where the chips are going to fall. Don't hold yourself to an unattainable standard.
I like that. Jeanine?
Yeah, I would say I would tell myself to give myself the same grace that I give to the attorneys that I teach and mentor, because they come into my office and they're crying and they're upset and they're mad at themselves and they're despondent because they've lost a case or whatever's happened. And I try to tell them, like, you have to let it go. You did the best job you could. I watched the trial. I saw what you did. There's nothing you could have done to change this outcome that you didn't do. So I'm always sometimes that's not true. Every once in a while, somebody really screws up and they need to be called on it. But in general, they've done everything that they can possibly do. And it's really easy for me to tell that to them. And I wish that I had, over the years, given myself the same benefit of the doubt, the same grace that I try to teach them to have with in their own minds and their own hearts.
I like that. So what about someone who's brand new coming to the job? What's your best piece of advice? Someone who is today's day one. You got them for 30 seconds. What do you say?
I tell everybody who starts in the unit that this job isn't for everybody, and it's not worth their mental or their physical or their emotional health. And so if they're here for a month or 2 months or 6 months and they decide they can't handle it, there's no shame in that. We'll find some place where they can prosper and everybody has a different thing. Like for me, I don't want anything to do with a DUI, an animal case, and I cannot stand elder abuse. Because every time I see my dad or my mom, everybody has a different thing. Like the sex crimes prosecutors don't want to do anything with child abuse, and the child abuse prosecutors don't want anything. So everybody has their own thing, and I tell them, this might not be for you. Even though you think it is now, don't be afraid to let me know if you're in distress or suffering.
What's the response? If someone says, I don't think I can do this job? How does the county attorney, what do they do with that person?
We get them out. County attorney now gets them out.
To a place they want to go? Do they get to pick, or is it just out you go, you back in the pool of where you're going to end up wherever?
No, so every year this started after you left, Lisa. So every year we're asked to fill out a form that says where we are now, what unit we're in now, and the top 3 places that we would like to go if we left that unit.
So they already have that information.
So they have that information, and they work with, sometimes it's just not, if you're in sex crimes and you decide you want to go to homicide, you might not be ready to go to homicide. They may not have an opening in homicide. They may have an opening for somebody with your experience in trial group, so you might have to go back there. But they will make every effort to get you out as quickly as they can. And if for some reason, let's say it's just a personnel issue, like we've actually had a lot fewer personnel issues since Rachel took over. But sometimes people just leave and we're understaffed. So we're always understaffed. It's better than it was. But if we can't get somebody out right away, they'll be told, okay, we'll get you out at the next rotation. They typically rotate people 2 or 3 times a year. And then we'll give that person a job within sex crimes that's less stressful. They're going to do a lower level of crime. They're not going to do the child sexual exploitation. Right.
We'll find failure to registers. And as the failure to registers come in, we're going to try to wean you away from this. And even when I was there, because Rachel was the bureau chief at the time, she was incredibly proactive, because I'd seen at least 3 people come, and they may not have been ready to admit it. But then when asked about it, it was not there. It was not for them. It was just that emotional piece of things didn't work out. But you think about when they did transfer, the one person that I know specifically transferred back down to trial group and then transferred over to gang. And when this person went to gang, this person was a superstar.
Okay, cool.
And it's one of those things where we recognize that this problem needs to be addressed immediately, because we don't want any more negative effects than already have occurred. There's steps that are taken immediately, like I said, with the failure to registers. Even if you can't make those changes, you may have to take a step back to get that step forward, depending on what the needs of the office are. And then when they find where their niche is, they just shine. Like for me, I would never want to be a gang prosecutor. It's not in my personality. It's not something that I would thrive at. And I don't think it would serve the county in any way. But as a sex crimes prosecutor, to Jeanine's point earlier, it takes a very specific type of person. And I think that was really where, when I got into that unit, I just felt that I was able to thrive shine and really have the opportunity to work with children and to really do everything I could to serve the community.
I am unaware, and I've been there a long time. And I will also say that I think right now I'm the only prosecutor in the office who's been in family violence, sex crimes, and homicide. So maybe some of them
Wow.
have been in 2 of 3,
Wow. That's a lot.
but so I think I say this with a certain amount of knowledge and experience. I have never seen them transfer somebody into family violence or sex crimes who did not want to go. If somebody is saying, I don't want to go there or I don't want to go back there, they're not going to put somebody there, because if you already don't want to be there, we're not going to destroy somebody's mental health just because we need to fill a space. So I have never seen that happen in my office. And other than when one particular person was the county attorney, I have never seen them ask somebody to take a case that the person didn't believe in. So I think that is something that is unique to Maricopa County. I teach a lot of other places. I'm on a lot of different committees. Everybody comes together and they are over all the child advocacy centers, the family advocacy centers. So she sees, I think, a lot of things in that capacity. But I think that this office is unusual. I know even in a lot of police departments, people are forced to go places that they don't want to be.
Yeah.
And I've seen officers absolutely lose their shit because they just can't handle it, or they're handling it and then you're handling it until you're not. And I've seen that happen with especially the officers who work in the child sexual exploitation units doing the computer crimes, because they're looking at horrible things all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you now answer the question about the what a piece of advice you would give to a brand new? I think Jeanine got that one.
30 seconds, I'd probably say find a hobby where nobody's talking back to you. Whether it be cooking, woodworking, exercise, where you're not absorbing.
So a hobby that doesn't speak back to you. I like that. Now that brings me into kind of what I wanted to ask you to close things up is how did you maintain a work-life balance doing all of this like horribly egregious, your work wasn't egregious, but this horrible crime type that you had to do for so many that you continue to do. How does one maintain work-life balance so that they can maintain their sanity and leave healthy? Because that's what I want. One of the things that I talk about, one of the themes in my podcast is when you leave the job, you leave healthy. So what do you do for work-life balance, and how can we make it so people leave the job healthy?
Well, I'm not sure I had a good work-life balance for many years. My job was everything to me. I wasn't married at the time. I didn't have any children. My family lives on the East Coast, except for my brother, who's a police officer. So he was a good support person for me. I worked all the time. I would be there on Saturdays. I would be there on Sundays. When I was home, I was thinking about my cases. When I was going to sleep, I was thinking about my cases. I really love what I do. So it wasn't always a sacrifice to do that. Looking back, can see how unhealthy that was for me. And I didn't make a change until 2009. My dad got really sick and he ended up in the hospital for over a month and then in hospice. And several months later, he passed away. That was the first time in my career that I had broken away from my work. Even when I was on vacation, I would be doing work. That was the first time in my career that I said, I just don't care what happens at work. Somebody will take care of it. They'll pick it up. They'll make sure the motion gets filed, whatever. And it was hard for me to do. But when I came back, I was able to see somebody was able to pick it up and do it. Somebody did come along and make sure that my cases were okay. And they were people who were good prosecutors. So that's when I started to have a little bit of a better balance. And then what really I think for me is when I met my husband, who it's actually funny because guess what he does? He's not a police officer. He's a forensic scientist in the crime lab. I was able to pull back now. And now I think I have a pretty good. It's not really something, again, and I'll give credit to Rachel and a little bit of credit to Alistair, who was the county attorney prior to Rachel, who unfortunately has passed away. That's when the change really came, because for years there was a lot of talk about work-life balance. And it's ironic, one time some people work a schedule that every other week you only work 4 days, okay? So they were doing this work-life balance class, and you had to go to one of the classes. And if the class was on your day off, you had to come in. There's the irony, right? So it wasn't until we had that change in administration, I think starting with Alistair coming in, that things started to shift a little bit. And now I think it's a lot easier for the newer prosecutors to have a little, and we teach them, actively teach them. Nobody taught us that.
Yeah.
Nobody said, this is just what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be tough. You're supposed to work all the time. You can't let anything bother you. You can't show any weakness. That doesn't work. That's how people end up. I know detectives who have committed suicide. I know detectives who have gone off the rails and they can't handle it. They quit. Their mental health is shot. They're doing drugs, they're alcohol, they're divorcing. So many of those things can happen to prosecutors too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You guys, it's a unique relationship being a detective that has submitted cases, because that's your baby and you want someone to take care of it. So I always appreciated having passionate prosecutors that really cared about the cases. And you can tell the people that can and the people that can't.
You ask this one over here.
Yeah. Okay.
About her work-life balance, because guess who was 9 months pregnant and in trial?
That is true.
I
went into labor the next day, and I needed a break because I was having some significant contractions.
She's there anyway.
So how did you maintain the work-life balance when you did it? Or were you able to, I guess?
I wouldn't say that I did it very well, but I would also say that my closest friends, Jeanine, and a handful of other people from that unit when I was there, are still my closest friends. I feel like we all went through something together, but separate, and we supported one another, we loved one another, we built each other up, and that's something that stands the test of time. So even if you were constantly on the clock, or you were constantly, I guess you could say, it's 5 a.m. and you're sitting on a house because you're worried that your victim is going to bolt on you, or it's 9 o'clock.
Night.
I do. Yeah. Or 9 o'clock at night and you're laminating letters from jail to prepare for trial. You're doing this with people that you are closer to than probably anybody else in the world. And in some instances, oftentimes, it didn't even feel like this work-life balance, because we were there together, working together, and just enjoying the work.
And that is life, when that's what you're doing and you're with the people that you care about. And it is so interesting how that everything that you both have been saying parallels that of a detective, not just a prosecutor, not just victim advocates, not anybody. It's the same thing, where you need to be with people that clearly care about the work as much as you do. And the push it down, suck it up, rub some dirt on it, doesn't work, isn't going to work anymore. And it's nice to see that there's steps have been taken and continue to be taken to keep people in a healthy place when they're doing this work, because there is no doubt in anybody's mind that this is very difficult work to do. And I commend you both for the time that you've spent doing the work. I very much appreciate all the things that you did for when I worked and submitted cases to you guys. When anybody else did that, same thing.
We always have opening for detectives at MCAO, so if you're feeling bored.
Don't tempt me. But I just want to say thank you guys so much for the work that you do. Any last thoughts that you'd like to make sure the world knows about Jeanine or Lisa?
I don't want anybody to know anything about me, but I want your listening public to know that at least the prosecutors in my office, and goes beyond my unit, sex crimes, they do that job because they want to make their community a better place. And especially now, there's a lot of criticism of police officers and prosecutors in the media we're either too tough or not tough enough. But everybody who's in there is doing the best they can every day to evaluate the cases, to work the cases, to work with the children, the murder victims' families, the burglary victims who are afraid to stay in their house. They're doing everything they can out of compassion and care for the community. And I think that sometimes that gets lost in the onslaught.
But I would even take it a step further, that it's not just that care, but that desire to do the right thing, to focus on what's right, to focus on justice. It's not about a win or lose. It's not a zero-sum game in anybody anybody that I know in the office. It's not a competition. It's about doing what's right. We've had cases where we've had to take alternative steps because things have happened in the process. But I think that love, that commitment that the prosecutors have in Maricopa County, as well as that continuous desire of doing the right thing. I think you've had cases where you've actually had to dismiss because you didn't believe, after so much investigation, after charges, after all the follow-up interviews, you weren't sure that you could prove that. And I think that's a very hard, going back to your conversation with both the victim and with the court and letting something go, but it's still that innate desire of doing the right thing and not necessarily doing what looks good. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both so very much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
It was fun.
You're
I
very
got to
welcome.
wear earphones and talk in a big microphone. I was hoping that you'd have one of these microphones.
Oh, you did?
I was really hoping.
I do.
Yeah, I've watched a couple of podcasts recently, and some of them don't. They're just sitting there in a chair. So I'm excited to see the picture.
I'm glad.
I was only disappointed that we couldn't tell the story about the sentencing. Can
we tell one last story?
Please do.
You
Absolutely.
Because it's really about you.
It's I don't know if it's about me, but the defendant in this trial that we had talked about a little bit earlier represented himself initially, and he got up in an opening statement and said, "I didn't have sex with her in Arizona. I may have had sex with her in Washington. In fact, I probably did have sex with her, but that happened in Washington."
And she wasn't 11, she was 13.
So this is his opening statement. So he immediately sits down and looks at his advisory counsel and says, "Why don't you just take the rest of the case?" So the defense attorney,
Wow.
he did, and obviously did his best. And his closing argument was basically, don't blame my client for being an idiot. The state can't make its burden, so you need to find him not guilty. He was found guilty. We were at sentencing before the court, and he wanted to represent himself at sentencing. And he looked at the judge when the judge says anything from the defense, and he says, "Yeah, look here, Andrew." And he starts calling the judge by his first name. "The only reason why I'm here is because of that bitch right there." And he starts pointing at Jeanine and just going off. And
I'm just sitting there like, it's not the first time somebody's called me a bitch in court.
Yeah.
She is incensed. She just jumps. I don't even remember. I just remember her jumping up and being like, hey, judge, did you hear what he just said? She just called him out on the judge is fine. Call me Andrew. You don't care, but she just went after this
Finger
guy.
out like you had on the other occasions.
Yes.
Ready to go.
Yeah, she really took after this guy. It was quite funny because Lisa is usually very mild-mannered and quiet, and sometimes we do a good cop, bad cop, and she's always the good cop. But you don't want to get this one angry. It is not pretty.
So was he able to successfully reduce his sentence with his compelling closing statement there?
No, he actually was convicted. I want to say there must have been
we had
12 or 14. Yeah, there was so many counts. And because she was 11, it was a mandatory 35 on anything that was sex conduct, and molest would be the range of 10 to 24. So, and everything's called a mandatory stack, or one sentence on top of the next, on top of the next, on top of the next.
Plus, just because I was disgusted with the letters he was writing her from jail, we decided to charge him with witness tampering. So just for the fun of it, we added on a bunch of witness tampering charges, which meant the jury got to hear the letters that he was sending her that were sexual in nature, that were saying what he wanted to do when he got out. He was ejaculating on the paper so that she would have that. He was telling her, go tell the prosecutor you made it all up, write out an affidavit, have it notarized, send it to the court. All of these things that he was telling her to do so that he assumed that if she did those things, we would dismiss the case. So the jury got to hear all of those things, and he was mad. He
Good.
was mad.
I hope so.
So that was fun.
That was a fun try.
I'm glad you guys are able to find a little bit of levity in such horror. So again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you guys being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Harmless the Podcast. If you like this episode, please tell 2 people that you think might enjoy it as well. And if you know someone who needs to hear this episode anonymously, or any of my episodes anonymously, feel free to contact me at harmlessthepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.